very much for attending our webinar, which will be presented today by myself, Jane Farmer, and Ebony Gaylor from the Australian Red Cross. Before I go any further, I'd also like to acknowledge both of our amazing teams who contribute to this work. We're gonna do a bit of a tag team between us, and hopefully that will be a great and connected experience. Hopefully my slides will go on. Yes. Okay. As has just been said, we also would like to acknowledge, on behalf of those present, all of the traditional custodians of all of the lands on which you guys are at right now, and where we are as well, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. So before I start, a bit of background as to what CSI is and my role within it. CSI is a national research and education centre, and we operate out of 3 partner universities. The University of Western Australia, University of New South Wales, and Swinburne University in Melbourne, where I work. And we aim to produce research that catalyses social change, and we're a leading provider of undergraduate courses and postgraduate programmes in social impact. More than that, we aim to build capacity in the social purpose sector and bring people together to create social change. I'm Director of Social Innovation at Swinburne University and a member of the CSI Swinburne team. Later you'll hear from Ebony, who's the Head of Mobilisation and Social Change at Australian Red Cross. You can find out more about CSI at the website address here. I'm now going to hand over to Ebony to quickly explain why there's so much interest in social connectedness.
Thank you, Jane. So yeah, my name's Ebony Gaylor. I head up the Mobilisation and Social Change team at Australian Red Cross. And what we do is we bridge a couple of areas from a research, a design, and a practical testing environment to do with social issues, complex social issues in an Australian context. We ask ourselves questions like, what does the future of humanitarian action look like? How does social change happen at a societal level and an individual level? And we want to understand the role of structured organisations in all of that. So we've looked at issues ranging from nuclear disarmament to homelessness, migration, disaster response, and now doing quite a bit in the COVID-19 response as well. And what we ask ourselves is, what are some of the common threads that cut across all of these complex issues? And how is it that you can actually design for social change at scale? And what we've found through a lot of our research is that healthy social connection plays a critical role across any of these issues. So we've really loved our relationship with Swinburne University, the research and the testing underway to figure out, is the role of a large organisation like this to actually design for healthy social connection, to nurture communities, amplify the assets and strengths, and look at solving complex social issues through an entirely different lens. So I will throw back to you, Jane, before we get into some of the practical examples.
Thanks, Ebony. Okay, so COVID-19 in particular highlights how much we need and how we engage with our social connections and what's missing during online connection. Although I think we've all got quite good at that lately. And also how exhausting just spending a whole day online socially connecting can be, prompting all of these kinds of questions that I have here, such as, why is it so hard to make new connections online? What can you do in Zoom, Teams and Skype, and what can't you do? How far can you get in connecting without physical presence? Can you have social connections with other things around you, such as a robot, or even your toaster, or the place that you live? And how do you provide behavioural interventions online? These are all questions that we've been throwing around with some of our industry partners lately. And what we intend to do in this brief talk is really to explain why social connection is so significant and explore what we call the kind of nuts and bolts or mechanics of social connection. And this is really important to understand how complex social connection really is when trying to make it happen for communities and ourselves, and to understand how to build social connection in when making social connection interventions. As with so much that is social and about us, we all tend to assume that we know all about it naturally, and we don't appreciate the deep science and evolutionary aspects that underlie it. So what we're trying to do is not to give you the panacea, but to show some of the things we really think that it's important to always be thinking about when you're planning and evaluating interventions for social connectedness. So first of all, the first thing we have to realize is we're a bit up against it in Western cultures. So individualism and autonomy have long been celebrated in our Western cultures. People used to think that infants required only their materialistic needs to be addressed, and the view that physical and mental and medical needs are of primary importance in older adults remains widely held today. But the biological fact remains that we are fundamentally a social species, and our nature is to recognize, interact, and form relationships with others. Here are some of the headlines from just a couple of days last week. Obviously, we've all been subject to these headlines on a daily basis. So if we didn't know so before, or weren't feeling like this before, just to let us all know we're all feeling anxious and alone. It feels like even before COVID though, there was a deep-seated social anxiety about loneliness and social isolation, and COVID-19 has perhaps just exacerbated this. And there's a whole lot of reasons for why this is happening in our contemporary society, and we don't really have time to explore those today. Suffice it to say that our current COVID angst has made our perception of loneliness and actual social isolation more considerable challenges, and definitely more discussed. First, let's deal with some definitions of terms. So the literature says that at its most fundamental, social connection is about interactions between individuals. I said this the other day to Eb from Red Cross, who's on here with me, and she told me she had a visceral reaction to this statement, presumably because it's a bit conservative seeming and assumes that it involves two human people who are able to interact with each other, implying that interaction requires these two people, or at least two people. And I guess one of our enduring questions is, can we make social connections with other things such as robots and place, God, and as I said earlier, your toaster? So secondly then, social isolation is another term that comes up a lot. Social isolation is a lack of contact between a person and others in society. So social connection then is the opposite of social isolation. Loneliness is a term we hear a lot these days, and loneliness is a perception of being socially isolated. So you'll have noticed that as well as these terms, there are many other similar terms thrown around in this space, such as social integration, social inclusion, social cohesion, social capital, social networks, and so on. All relevant, all meaning slightly different things. Our focus has been on social connection and social connectedness. And that's because we take a strengths-based approach to this space, believing that focusing on people's social assets and building on these is a more useful approach than emphasizing and consequently potentially stigmatizing deficits. So we're a bit wary of the idea of loneliness shaming, and also of simply measuring levels of loneliness and social isolation and going, oh my God. The point is to activate in a positive direction. It can be frustrating for those of us who've tried to activate or orchestrate social connection through interventions. We find obviously that these don't always work or work to varying degrees, and that people don't rush to take up these amazing opportunities we offer to them to volunteer or to meet each other. And this is because social connection is incredibly complex. It involves a whole lot of these things here: learning by social observation, recognizing the shifting status of your connections, anticipating and coordinating efforts between individuals, using language and communication, orchestrating relationships, navigating complex social hierarchies, and so on and so forth. And doing all of this across timeframes that stretch from a person's distant past to multiple possible futures. It quite possibly involves other dimensions that aren't in this matrix and have yet to be fully comprehended. such as body language, sensory perceptions, and physical presence. And that's at the individual level. At the community level, we know that more connection is associated with better community outcomes of collective action, disaster preparedness, recovery, and resilience. So one particular feature of our work as well is drawing together what we like to think of as a transdisciplinary science of social connection. And that involves taking and combining evidence from psychology, sociology, physiology, communications, technology, and many more disciplines. So let's consider this some of the fundamental nuts and bolts of this transdisciplinary science of social connection. And let's start by understanding some of these basic components as layers, numbers, and quality. If you look up how many friends should I have on the internet, which I have done, you'll encounter the work of Robin Dunbar. He's an evolutionary psychologist, and he's been able to show that humans tend to build social connections in similar ways and have done across history and in different places and contexts. So an immediate, intimate layer tends to feature around 5 people. Then we have a layer of close and useful connections, about 15 people, a tribe of about 50 people that we feel we belong to, and then a wider network of acquaintances of about 150 people. This last layer could include all manner of people we see incidentally, but know that such as your barista, your accountant, a person that services your car, and so on. This pattern was observed in Dunbar's surveys of village and tribe sizes internationally, size of armies, ancient and modern, appropriate company size, and in patterns of relationships in Facebook and online gaming. Of course, these numbers have considerable variation around the mean. A second absolutely key issue here is quality of connections. So one problem is that you could have all these connections, and you could have some very close and intimate connections, but some might not be entirely positive, such as in abusive relationships. In this situation, the quality of relationships comes into play. And various academics and researchers and theorists have looked at different ways of conceptualizing the quality of connections. For example, looking at positive and negative bonds between people. One that I particularly like is the idea of Fisk that considers the equivalence of inputs and outputs to relationships. So these inputs and outputs in interactions between people need to be in balance, and if they're not, there's a bit of a problem. You might have experienced this yourself when you've been flat sharing with people and someone doesn't clean the toilet enough or take the bin out enough. With Australian Red Cross, we sought to build all of these nuts and bolts of social connection into what can loosely be understood as a kind of investment model about social connection. You can see in the middle there that idea of layers and numbers of people in layers, as I've talked about. But also we need to think about these inputs and outputs to our social connections. So looking across the literature, we can find that there's pretty consistent evidence that the kinds of inputs that we have to put in are obviously our time, the amounts of time we invest in different connections, and the amount of emotional attachment. Outputs consist of 2 categories of feelings and practical resources. In terms of feelings, we can think of things that we get from our connections like identity, acceptance, happiness, security, control, trust. And in terms of practical resources, we get things like assistance, advice, referral, sharing, and encouragement. We tried to build the sort of vast evidence base that we found about this into this idea of this investment tool, so that people can very simply understand how to build their connections, appreciate what they have, and figure out what to work on in order to get these positive outputs. Unfortunately, it's still not that simple. As humans, we have to figure out who we are in relation to others, and we're mostly likely to bond or connect with those that we think are like us, i.e. other members of our tribe. So we're always looking out for ways that we can assess whether we like people or whether we're not like people. And sometimes we're just not like these other people that we're meeting. We also try to work out where we fit in the social hierarchy. If we meet a new person, we work out, are they more expert than me? Are they richer than me? Do they speak with a different accent to me? Where do I fit in relation to them? Those processes of when we first meet to becoming friends are a process of working out our social categorization in relation to them. And we do this by all kinds of ways of listening, looking, gesturing, the clothing we wear, who we hang out with, how other people treat us in our day-to-day life, and so on. And clearly, this makes it all very difficult to make new connections in COVID time, as we have so few opportunities to pick up these social clues in these kind of one-dimensional Zoom experiences that we've all got so used to. And so far, we've mainly featured psychological and sociological explorations of social connection, but let's now turn to physiological aspects. So there's a lot of evidence that loneliness has impacts on physical health. And these have been highlighted extensively, including impacts on cardiovascular disease and diabetes. At a cellular level, loneliness stimulates inflammation and impacts on immunity. Researchers noted levels of immune cells are notably different in those who score as very lonely compared with those who do not. This is caused by evolutionary effects urging the person to quickly get back with the group or their tribe, as being alone and isolated is dangerous. It's a clear, evolutionary built biological defense mechanism. Recent studies have probed interventions to tackle this physiological expression. One study found that simply asking lonely people to perform acts of kindness to others significantly reduced feelings of loneliness and the negative biological responses. Simple acts of kindness included running an errand for a neighbour or helping a colleague with a computer problem. And the researchers also interestingly found that online acts of kindness had the same feelings and biological effects. Okay, so we've started to move to solutions. Which activities improve social connectedness? And these are obviously things that once we know about them, we can think about how can we build this into our online or currently constrained environment. We've talked about simple acts of kindness. Moving back to talking about Robin Dunbar, his research has also shown that singing, dancing, laughing, and storytelling can produce positive connection effects. Feelings, good feelings, and release of endorphins. From our own studies of workplaces, we've found a range of activities that promote social connection and social integration, including involving people in group problem-solving activities, pairing up people in mentoring and mentee relationships, and this idea of bumping spaces, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is kind of space that enables or activates incidental meetings between each other. Facilitation is a useful strategy and drawing on naturally occurring community connectors. A study we've done at Swinburne has found that communities have natural connectors, and these can be harnessed and acknowledged as a community force for good. Working to connect less connected people, community connectors are good at being both persistent and patient to seize opportunities to connect people with one another, community groups, men's sheds, and other resources in the community. Significantly, evidence suggests that connection is best brought about as a byproduct of purposeful activity or other interventions. That is, calling together a group just to socially connect or meet other lonely people is much less likely to connect people than a group looking to solve a neighbourhood problem, take action to help others, or even just to go fishing together. So what about pro-connection spaces and places? Some places and spaces are more pro-connection compared with others. There's a significant literature on the idea of third spaces, which can have the useful effect of bringing people together across status or identity divides to make a new shared identity around a shared activity, place, or new group. In these kinds of places, as well as social connection happening, we also have the idea of social integration happening because people from different backgrounds are meeting each other. And in those that talk about social capital, this is the idea of bonding and bridging connection going on. Some of these spaces and places that have this kind of equalizing and connecting function are places like op shops, libraries, public parks, neighborhood houses, community gardens, farmers markets, and some types of events that can be welcoming to all. However, to get social connection activated, we need to ensure that there are activities in there that encourage interaction, such as the ones I referenced on the previous slide. Group problem solving, facilitation, these purposeful bumping spaces, all acting within these equalizing third spaces to activate people to interact and get to know each other across divides. But we should always remember that it isn't easy for people to connect because evolution has made us wary of people we don't know. They may be violent, and as we know, they may have contagious diseases. So evolution tells us to hang back and be risk averse. Before I hand back to Ebony to talk about what Red Cross is doing, I just want to tell you what we're doing next with our huge base of evidence that we've built up. We really seek a kind of general upgrade in community awareness about social connection. And this is akin to what's happened in recent years with things like mental health first aid, mental health awareness. This is about knowing the basic nuts and bolts of social connection and what are sensible, likely ways to activate it. People don't need to make this up or constantly reinvent the wheel. There is a big evidence base. Following our 3-year program with Australian Red Cross, we are ready to translate our evidence into these outputs that I have on the screen just now. So we're working up online short courses about social connection for different contexts, design guidelines for optimizing social connectedness, sets of toolkits and educational materials for use by individuals and with community, design principles for building social connectedness into online platforms. And we encourage you all to get in touch with us to see if you'd like to be part of a partnership to promote social connectedness at work and in communities. And I'm going to hand back to Eb to talk about the practicalities of social connection in real life community contexts, and also to talk a bit about our ideas around hybrid reality and social connection.
Cool, thank you, Jane. So I think if anyone's a little bit like me, you're probably now at the point of thinking that social connection is a little more complicated than we originally thought. It's been a really fantastic relationship for us to have with Swinburne University, where it started out of me wanting a recipe or a roadmap or a number that helps us not only understand social connection, but design for it at scale. So what I want to talk to you about next, oh, hang on, is what we're doing from a design perspective through the Red X team at Australian Red Cross. And what I've got here is an example social design canvas that we use for any of our initiatives. Like many, 3 years ago, we started out looking through the lens of loneliness because that was the hot topic during that time. And we went pretty deep into the research and evidence around what is loneliness, what does it mean, how are people experiencing it, and what does it mean both at an individual and at a community level. Very quickly, we realised that this was essentially the tip of the iceberg, and we were looking at this social issue from one part of that complex to get under the hood and understand some of the enablers for why it was existing. We also found that there were some key pieces of literature that were really missing for us as well. We found that much of the literature was deficit-based, to Jane's earlier points, around everybody being lonely or everybody being worried about being lonely and then everybody dying from being lonely. And that it was also really hard to find any practical applications of what was happening beyond a therapeutic setting. So how do you do this at a much more societal level? So what you can see here is we've got some of the high-level evidence base that we've used, but then we look at the enablers of what makes that happen. So what we found from a social connection perspective is that it's not seen at an individual or at a community level, both from a data and insights perspective. So there's no really great nationwide or global data sets that help us understand our experience of connection or of not being connected. And at a more physical and individual level, it's not like a sprained ankle or a broken arm. It's different to a mental health issue and how it presents. So to get visibility of what this is, both in terms of strong, healthy social connection and disruptors, is really hard. We also know that it's very easy to do nothing about. Because so many of us are experiencing disruptions in our sense of connection, because we don't really quite know what it is, it's really easy to ignore and put on the back burner. Again, at an individual level, we have other priorities, bills to pay, kids to put into school, hopefully one day. So to prioritise this as a human need, both individually as well as at a service level, is quite difficult to do. There's no one department or organisation actually responding or responsible for leading this work. One of the most interesting things we found was, we will have all seen exponential curves coming out our ears over the last few years, but this growth in a gap between our perception and actual real life experience of connection. For many of us, we hold these traditional ideals and values of what healthy connection looks like, of staying married, the nuclear family, staying in touch with primary school friends, talking to our neighbours, a certain number of Facebook groups, chatting over the fence and putting down our phones. But our experience of that in a day-to-day is changing so massively that we're just seeing this increasing gap of our expectations and then the reality of how we're experiencing that. And so what we do is we feel anxious and bad about that without having some of the practical tools to know what to do next. We then sort of, don't know why my slides are doing that, sorry guys. We then start to look at, so if we want to design for significant change in this space, what are some of the things we could look at? Everybody is experiencing loneliness, and what are we going to do? We start to look at how do we shift some of our perceptions and experiences of loneliness and disruptions to our sense of connection. How do we start to bridge the gap between what we think connection looks like and what it really looks like in a modern society? So one of the first things we did was come up with that model that Jane referenced, which is really trying to understand connections at a network level. What are the strengths and assets that we can use for individuals and communities to be able to design to leverage and amplify their sense of connection, rather than feeling like we need to channel them into structured versions of that connection. So for example, rather than channeling someone directly into a service, what are some of the strengths and assets that we can get visibility of in your network and use as a support network? And I think COVID's a really good live example of that. We also started to think of what are the mind shifts that need to happen. If we've got this old school idea around what connection looks like, we need to help people see that connection operates very differently at a network level. So it's not as simple as this relationship meets my needs, this activity doesn't, this relationship doesn't. Actually, what we find with connection is it's about the network effect of all of those behaviours, activities and relationships that are involved, which then makes it really tricky from a services perspective of how is it that you can actually design for improving healthy social connection if it's not just about finding all the lonely people. We also started to think, and this is particularly relevant, I guess, for any organisation working in this space like Red Cross, the idea of disruptions to our sense of connection. And we sort of think that this happens in chronic and clustered ways. And the way that I would describe some of the chronic disruptions to our sense of connection is in spaces where there's intergenerational disadvantage, long-term mental health issues, exiting of the justice system, limited access to health and education. So some of those deep systemic issues that mean that we are just limited or disrupted in our sense of connection over a long period of time. We also know that there are clustered triggers to our sense of connection, and that these triggers are often really visible in our lives. We're all living a visible clustered trigger at the moment. And with the other space that we find this happens is in other types of disasters. If there's a fire that goes through an entire community, then overnight you can lose your home, loved ones, pets, access to education, to your local barista, a whole range of things that really built your sense of connection to something greater than yourself can be removed in a very immediate and clustered way. And we often navel gazed, 6 months ago to say, imagine if there were a time where overnight everybody was having to shift to much more hybrid ways of interacting. And here we are. So what we've done from a Red Cross perspective is we have taken those insights and how do we design interventions that help us better understand this environment? So rather than trying to design to solve loneliness, what we do is really try to understand, I'm just going to get that slide back up, sorry. We're not thanking anyone yet. Just get you back to that. Jane, can I get you to get me back to that beat loneliness slide? Is that okay? Just to prompt my thinking. So we designed specific interventions that help us gather insights about what's really happening in community. We've done that across a range of areas. And as I said, the first place we started was actually coming up with an evidence-based model, which is the beauty of our relationship with Swinburne, is they can do this incredible depth into what are all of the disciplines saying when we talk about healthy social connection. And we started to test that through some digital tools, through conversations with our practitioners, and looking across our programs and services to say, well, how is it that you actually design for healthy social connection? We also wanted to shift the narrative about loneliness and healthy social connection. So we did a test called Beat Loneliness, which was about amplifying the great things that digital environments and spaces offer to our sense of connection. So rather than saying, put away your phone, jump off Facebook, start having meaningful eye contact and talking to your neighbours, we're actually saying, what is it that this diversity of digital spaces and hybrid environments really offer to people? We then have started to look at the role of super connectors, so, and particularly in workplaces. So as people start to work in more disrupted ways, and again, COVID, a very good example of this, but as we start to work in things like the gig economy, what is it that the role of workplace can really offer for us? And so we've done a podcast series linking in with Uber drivers and others to say, well, what's it like for you to not have tangible relationships that are beyond some of those transactional bits that you have in the workplace? And we started to gather stories about what it means to not have that standard workplace that you arrive Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, the person checking on how did your weekend go, how are the kids? What does that mean when that's actually removed? So we'll be releasing that podcast series really soon as well. We've also been really interested in the role of to some of Jane's points earlier around action and kindness. So we've done some great work in mapping humanitarian responses more broadly, but also specifically in relation to the bushfires, and seeing how is it that community connects and responds when there is a growing need that emerges in community. And then the last one that I just want to mention is we've just literally this week launched a service called COVID Connect, which is a telephone outreach service for people who are feeling like their sense of connection has been disrupted as a result of COVID-19, which is a number of us. And it's a volunteer service. So we are training up volunteers in some of the tips and tricks of navigating and nurturing a sense of connection during a time like this. And it's also offering a call to people who might be just needing a general social chat during the week. So it's directly taking all of our research and evidence that we've been building with Swinburne over the years and seeing what happens when you apply that in a really practical community setting. Then this last slide here is, I guess, the thing that I could probably talk about forever with Jane. So we're very happy to keep doing that offline, but it's this idea of the future of social connection and what does that mean in more hybrid environments. And by hybrid, I guess the thing that I mean there is that there are loads of ways that we can think about healthy social connection. But if we're thinking about COVID-19 in particular, we are right now experiencing relationships, activities, spaces and places that have to bridge in real life and physical experiences as well as digital environments. And we don't have the knowledge, the narrative or the practical tools to help us figure out how to navigate and build healthy relationships and a healthy sense of connection during that time. So my research focus in this space is really about what is it that actually makes us feel connected, and can you actually start to design and shift for some of those in different spaces? Can we replace it with something as simple as a two-dimensional Zoom? Or if we drop a background behind us, does that make us feel a little more connected and vibrant? I also want to know, can you actually measure it beyond feelings? So we can all say that we feel or don't feel connected at various points, but I'm desperately searching, similar to that first model with Jane, for that number, you know, that metric that tells us at a human and at a societal level, what is it that makes us feel more connected? What disrupts us? And what is it that happens in the brain and the body when that happens? Then ultimately what we want to know is, can we design for change in these spaces? So can we design physical environments, digital environments like this that use some of those mechanics or attributes to actually improve our sense of connection? So can we take something as awful as the iPhone or Facebook or Zoom and design that for connection rather than consumption? So this gives you a little bit of a headline look into how we're thinking about healthy social connection. It is without a doubt one of those topics that you talk to anyone, you know, from my mum to professors like Jane, and it gets everybody out of their chair. This is something we know is relevant and matters to us. And I think we know it now more than ever, as we have overnight had layers of our network of connection removed. So thank you so much for joining us here on this session. It is absolutely the start of a journey. It is definitely the start of the journey. So thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to the Q&A, but I'll throw you over to Rhonda.
Thank you so much, Ebony. That was really interesting, and to Jane too. I loved both of your presentations. And it looks like a lot of people who are in this webinar did too, because I've had lots of chats and lots of questions come through. So maybe, Ebony, if I could just get you or Jane to exit out of the presentation, because that way we can then see everyone, if you're in gallery view, who've got their videos on. And while you're doing that, I'll just start with a few of the questions that have come through. A lot of people are saying, great presentation, thank you so much. Okay, so I'll start with some of the questions that were asked earlier on. So from Corin, can Jane please talk more about the study on online random acts of kindness?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Have we done what you need us to do with the presentation?
I can still see it. So if you could just exit, maybe stop sharing your screen. There you go. Awesome.
Awesome.
Look at
yeah, sure.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, cool. Yeah, look, this is a study that I discovered randomly. I think one of the things is about social connection is it's everywhere and nowhere, and it's not very precisely discussed. So our trawling extends from, it's just a kind of day-to-day trawling to find relevant things. This is a whole body of work that appears to be being done by a group of people in the US. The key researcher that I found was someone called Lipomersky. I can definitely send some references after this. These people have been looking at happiness, I think. So I think their whole focus is on happiness as an antidote to loneliness. And I can share some information afterwards.
Hey, Jane, I think the other one to add would be some of the great work we've been doing with other parts of your team around the idea of efficiently do good. So our work at Red Cross is looking at how do we pivot from this idea of there are people who need help and people who give help to actually realizing that people want to take action and do good to help their way out of their own vulnerability. So there's been a nationally representative sample that the guys have been testing this with, and we'll be releasing the report in the next couple of months. But it shows really well that people want to help their way out of their own experiences of whether it's isolation, vulnerability, or whatever else.
Yeah, I think it's about that idea of equalizing your social status. So no one likes being vulnerable or perceiving themselves as vulnerable. So it's kind of a strengths-based approach. Yeah.
So we've had a massive influx of questions come in. So we've got 14 minutes. Just with the resources, what I might do is get Jane and Ebony to send me what they have promised everyone. And then when I send the survey out, I'll add all of those in. And then, of course, the recording will come later. Can you tell us more about the social connectedness fact sheet, Jane?
Well, there's a fact sheet that we did for CSI, which is available through CSI. There's also the work that we've done with the Red Cross on the kind of investment tool, I guess. Again, we're preparing to put that up on Analysis and Policy Observatory, APO, where it will be available. And yeah, we can certainly send it as an online resource to anyone individually. So again, we'll give the connection and the resource to Rhonda, and that can be available.
I just popped the fact sheet link up there too, because I know it off by heart. Okay, so from Julia, Jane and others in the sector, I'd like to discuss how tech can be used to jumpstart community building. So probably this is an Ebony.
Yeah, give this one to Ebony.
So I think what we know from the literature is that it doesn't help or hinder. Shock horror, it's a tool and a facilitator that can be used to really positively nurture your sense of connection, but also really disrupt it, just in the same way that any kind of relationship can. I think, my particular interest in this space is being a little more tech agnostic, to say, well, what is it with relationships and activities that have to bridge both physical and digital environments, and how is it that you actually design to nurture those? So we're busily trying to understand that. But what I would say is that it's pretty undercooked in that space. Just got my lovely family operating in the back. Yeah, it's COVID-19. So yeah, I would say it's really undercooked in this space. I think we confuse interaction with connection, and let's not forget that the way that I see connection is not an individual to individual relationship. It is overall, how satisfied are you with your sense of connection to the world beyond yourself? And tech may play a role in that, but for some people I've seen through the comments, it may well be your dog, or it may well be your toaster. But it's one of those bits. My interest is in what can we give to designers and platform builders to say these are the attributes that we need to take account for, that are not just rallying up the message count, but are actually building our sense of overall.
Great, thanks so much. I hope I pronounced this right. Kalipi, that question of measurement is intriguing and critical. What insights on this so far? I'm not sure what she's referring to, but
no, I think so. I'll have a little go, and then Ebony can have a go. So when I first started thinking about this 3 years ago, and I can remember telling my boss that what we really needed was some technology that when you connected with someone, it did like a ping or a count. And guess what? The government are just trying to get us to do this in terms of COVID-19 connectedness. So given that that's probably not something that we're going to all have for social connection for obvious reasons, I think there's different ways of looking at it. So one way is to go, okay, we know all of these things are things that actually generate connectedness. Evidence shows these activities, these spaces, these places. So let's look at doing these and then just basically counting how much of that activity we do, which is obviously a sort of process or output measure. I think down the line, there's lots of measures of community connectedness that have been collected. There's a group in Canada that's collected all of these into a review, all the different ones. As Ebony said, I don't think any of them individually or specifically measure social connection, because it's quite a hard thing to measure, but they do measure things like civic participation, political participation, volunteering activity, that kind of thing, which are sort of in the loose ballpark of social connection. So yeah, look, it's another question that is constantly asked of us, and it's kind of within the program of work that we're doing to kind of generate some guidelines and checklists about this. Ebony, do you want to respond?
Yeah, like I think this is one that's really easy to bastardize, right? It's really easy for us to come up with a nationwide metric of, happiest country and most connected or most disconnected. I think if I go back to that sort of social design canvas that I showed earlier, the blue squares, one of the critical things that we need to do to help shift that narrative is show people what it is that makes you feel more connected. And so that, I keep saying to Jane, I want the Fitbit, the cardiovascular disease, 10,000 steps. Like, what's the thing that I can go, okay, no, I can wipe that off my worry list. I've got this. But I need to know what that is beyond feelings. We know through all of our work, there is huge intent to action gap. So everybody intends to be a thriving member of community, to feel connected and be a connector. But we know in reality, that's not how it plays out. So I want to know what happens in the brain or the body beyond the survey. I want to know what happens to us when we feel either more connected or disruptions to our connections. we plan to research that pretty heavily through my research with Jane. So, give us a few years. And
this is Ebony's PhD topic.
Wow. Okay, so Kobe, Jane touched on the potential to be connected to environments and things. I'd love to hear more about this. We know some cultures have social connections with species, rivers. People might have a connection with a particular tree in their garden or a park. Does this fit into your plans, frameworks?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember one workshop we did at Red Cross where someone who was facilitating asked everybody at the start where and how did they feel most connected, and about half of the group actually talked about places, which was really interesting. And I mean, I basically said Scotland, and thinking about that, it's about things where you feel comfortable, that you kind of fit in, that you're not having to try so hard, that they are of your culture and identity and DNA. So I think that whole idea of place is definitely a part of who we are, and it's part of our identity, it's part of our feelings of belonging, it's part of our understanding of ourself, and it comes into that sort of whole idea of social identity, I think. But again, it's something that we need to disaggregate and explain a bit more. It's like there's so many jumping off points with this topic, and obviously they all layer together, but each one individually deserves its own specific kind of depth dive.
Ebony, anything to add on that one?
No, all good.
Okay. It's all right, we've got heaps to get through. So 6 minutes. So Kate from Health Futures Australia, this is an interesting one. We're experimenting with a public preventative health lens with social prescribing and elevating neighbourhood houses as prevention hubs in the Central Highlands region. I'd be interested in knowing, do the presenters endorse the idea of social prescription, or is there a better way to do things?
Well, interestingly, I was talking about this when I was out walking with my daughter last night. Look, I think social prescribing, it apparently looks like a response to vulnerability on the surface of it, right? And we kind of, in our work, what we've sort of found is that you need to make people feel that they're in a position of strength, so we're equally able to give to each other. So if social prescribing comes from the perspective of, oh dear, you poor soul, you're lonely and you're not connected, then, and social prescribing is going to do that for you, then I think it has the potential to do that kind of stigmatizing or deficiting. But if it comes from the perspective of, hey, you know what, you need to go fishing, or hey, you know what, you should go to the men's shed, they have great carpentry there, or you know what, this is awesome craft group started up for women, or whatever, then I think social prescribing is totally cool. But a bit like social distancing is really physical distancing. Maybe we shouldn't be kind of, I don't know, labeling these things and actually making them more fit with the evidence.
The only thing I'd add to that is COVID-19 has been really interesting because we've had an outpouring of people wanting to help, right? And the question I get asked all the time is, we'll do anything. We'll move our company, whatever you need. Just show us the vulnerable people. Take us to the vulnerable people and we'll help them. And my response is, here, let's, we are all overnight experiencing vulnerability. We have had our sense of connection disrupted very, very deeply, and we don't yet fully understand the implications of that yet. So the sooner we can start to see that we all have a responsibility to be able to help our way out of any community situation. You just got to look at the stats of mental health, family violence, and anything else. But that's an uncomfortable position. So Beat Loneliness, we positioned everybody as the solution. So captains of virtual Rocket League teams, we were saying, what you're doing is phenomenal. You are solving loneliness. So here's a kit, here's a shirt, talk to your team about social connection and loneliness. So surely an option in a space that I agree, but I think the more we can position people as helping their way out of the situation, the better.
Great. Next one, probably for you, Ebony. Can you give an example of a successful digital third space, and was it successful? From Dylan.
So there is a game, I'll go back to Beat Loneliness, which is the main digital space that we've operated in, and Rocket League, which is cars that play soccer. I forget how many millions of players this game has globally. What I would say about that is that, you know, there's, like any space, there will be pros and cons to how that operates. What we found through the teams that we were interacting with is it was the bridging of those spaces. So the ability for somebody experiencing deep isolation or anxiety, being able to safely play in a way that they controlled. And so I think the role of power and control is really important in connection. Then meant that they ended up meeting some of the events, so the relationship started to build off from there. So I think digital spaces are not an end unto themselves. What's lacking is the dynamic view of all of the different spaces and modes for us to connect in a sort of dynamic view of what connection looks like, taking all of those into account.
Great, thank you. There's heaps of really interesting comments in the comment section. I encourage everyone to look at it, particularly Jane and Ebony. I'm just looking for a last question. Oh, from Carla. I love the idea of efficiently doing good. Is there info on this or not just yet?
Yeah, so I'll have a little mini paper out soon, but we're just finalising the research. We have a knack for distracting Jane's team with things like bushfires and the like. So we've done a whole range of behavioural work around how is it that you actually design for people to take action rather than making it really hard for them. The idea being that from the moment you wake up, how do I put as many things as possible in front of you to do good and take action in ways that you may not even be cognizant of. So yep, that research will be available really soon, but I'll be posting a Medium article about it in the next couple of weeks as well.
Great. Can I ask one more question? It's from Sean. He's actually a CSI student. So he's interested, he works at Fraser's Property. He's interested to get thoughts on what role property developers can play.
Well, look, I think, as I said, one of the things that we want to produce out of this is this whole idea of spaces and places of connection, and with that overlayer of activities of connection. So we can show the kinds of spaces and public spaces and places that property developers should build into their developments, but also, I guess, even into the design of flats and apartments. And we've been looking a lot, as I said, at workplaces and the kinds of spaces and places that people use to connect. So it's not the usual suspects. Often it's not, places where, for example, coffee shops, which are pro-social connection, you're not going to go and connect with other people in the coffee shop unless you're an extremely extroverted person. So it's about building in these kind of bumping spaces, these incidental spaces, but they also have to be safe. People have to feel safe in them. And the idea of these kind of connected activities, I think it's interesting that some property developers and estate agent type companies are supporting community gardens, for example, which are a sort of classic space of social connection and social integration. So what I would say is, wait for us to produce the design guidelines, but in the short term, there's a lot of evidence on this. You don't necessarily need to make it up yourself.
That's good. There's a few little questions, or not little, there's a few questions we've missed, and I've just said to everyone that perhaps I'll send those through to Jane and Ebony. We might answer them in another way and then get back to everyone. I will be emailing everyone with a survey. Sometimes emails don't get through due to security issues at the other end. So if you don't hear from us, please email us and we'll get back to you, and there'll also be the recording. This webinar has actually been the most interactive out of all the ones we've had. So that's a good thing.
That's right.
Any closing words, Jane or Ebony?
No, just thank you all very much for being enthusiastic I would, as I said, we know everyone's got experiences and examples. So do get in touch. It's useful to keep building this kind of coalition of knowledge and evidence. Yeah, really interested to hear from you. And I guess we seek investment in this space. So if you work for an organization that would like to support some specific projects in this space in partnership with the Red Cross, and others on this call, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been 3 years of deep research and some really solid testing with communities to start to make sense of this. So the next step for us is getting design principles, getting really solid tools and resources out there that can be applied by many organisations and institutions. So anybody who's keen to jump on board and be part of that, we are certainly, we'll just hang on the Zoom, Jane, for the rest of the day.
That's right. And sadly, I've got a hideous bureaucratic meeting coming up. But otherwise, we can hang on Zoom with people, for sure.
Alrighty, thanks so much, everyone, and we will be in touch. Thank you.
You.
Bye.